meet in here. It's my pleasure today to introduce to you our 29th Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral Gary Roughead was appointed in September 2007, and he'll be our first speaker. I will tell you that the fact that he can travel to Newport to talk to all of you shows you how important this series of workshops and conferences and panels will be. It's a very, very interesting, and hopefully will be give you an idea of some of the things that we see in this future. We couldn't do this without the Naval War College Foundation. The foundation now has over 6,000 members. It's the largest it's ever been, and the network is expanding. I just can't tell you how pleased I am to be able to stand up here in this beautiful facility and talk to people who are loyal and support this wonderful institution now in its 125th year. This is our anniversary year, and the students graduating this year who are mixed among you are from the anniversary class, and I couldn't be more happy. We'll graduate them on Friday. So without further ado, let me turn the podium over to our Chief of Naval Operations, Gary Roughead.
Thank you. Well, good morning, and it's really great to be back in Newport. Phil, thanks for all you do to make the Current Strategy Forum possible, to you and your staff. I also have to commend you on the fact that for every event that I've been privileged to attend up here over the last couple of years, you've handled the weather magnificently. That sets Newport off in a unique way. But it is good to be back. Coming back to Newport for me brings back many, many memories, and in fact, last night when I arrived, my wife and I walked into an establishment, and the first person that I saw was my first department head in the Navy. So Cody, it was great to see you again, and it reminded me of more carefree times. And then this morning, had the opportunity to reunite with a friend of mine from high school, Joe Brito, who is here in the audience and has become actively involved in the foundation. So I feel like I'm 18 years old again, and we're going to talk about a few things. I think that the Current Strategy Forum is so important to be able to come together and have serious discussions about our national security outside of the Washington Beltway, because it's easy to get a particular perspective when you're inside Washington, and to have leaders, men and women from around the country, indeed around the world, come together to talk about things that are important to our future, I think is extraordinarily important. I'd also like to thank the speakers that will be participating in the forum, especially my fellow service chiefs, my good friend General Jim Conway, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and our new Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Bob Papp, who I've known for many years. I normally stay at the Current Strategy Forum for the duration because I find that simply being part of the discussion, listening to the comments, listening to the questions, gives me an insight into the many issues that we deal with, and as I said, perspectives that I normally don't get into Washington. But regrettably, as soon as this session is over, I'm on an airplane to Hawaii. I don't regret going to Hawaii, but the fact of the matter is that I will be joining my Japanese counterpart there tomorrow to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Japan-U.S. security agreement. There will be the Japanese training squadron, a group of young officers from our Navy who will come together to lay the foundation for what I know will be another 50 years of a truly unique alliance and relationship that exists in the world today. And I think that being able to do that really reinforces the theme of this conference, which is partnerships and networks and the emerging global order. So in a way, I'll just carry the message from Newport to those young people that I'll be meeting with. Before I talk about the future, the perspectives that I may have, I think it's important to note that even though we are looking to the future, there should be no question in anyone's mind about the commitment and the level of involvement of the United States Navy in the fight that we are in the Middle East. On any given day for the past few years, we have had more sailors on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan and in the Horn of Africa than we have at sea. In fact, today there are 14,000 sailors on the ground with ground units in headquarters in those three areas that are doing absolutely incredible work. 14,000 on the ground, 10,000 at sea on any given day. And in fact, most of the fixed-wing aircraft that are flying off of Afghanistan on any given day, you'll see about 30 to 50% of the sorties flying off of Afghanistan coming from our one aircraft carrier that supports those operations. But before I speak about the networks and the partnerships that are going to be so important to the emerging global order, I'd like to speak about the importance and the fragility of that order that is starting to emerge. The most recent global order or orders are worth remembering briefly before we delve into the circumstances we find ourselves in today. We had the post-Cold War era, which I would consider to be that period of time right before September 11th. We had the Cold War era, and we look back on those times in the world that we live in today, we look back on those times with a sense that perhaps there was a higher degree of relative peace, perhaps partly because we did not have in those times, with the exception of Korea many years ago and Vietnam shortly less than that, we didn't have that commitment of large ground forces committed in conflicts there. And order in those areas was not necessarily maintained by this commitment, by the engagement of ground forces, but it was rather maintained by credible military presence offshore, either at sea itself or in the air with those aircraft coming from the sea. In those eras, we had the blockade of Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that perhaps was the closest that we have ever come to nuclear war. We had numerous non-combatant evacuations. We had SEAL and small unit operations. We had aerial bombardments from land and sea-based aircraft. We had tanker escort duties in the Arabian Gulf, and we had numerous shows of force to help maintain the global order, which for the most part, the nation felt that we were at peace. So that was the old order. Those were the good old days where peace predominated, but not without plenty of skirmishes that required our attention and where in many cases were handled by a constantly deployed Navy. So as we look at the emerging order today, one that has been shaped by the events of September 11th and one that will fully shape after we draw down from the ground activity in the Middle East, which will come at some time, and as the President has said, is set to begin starting next summer, in the summer of 11, based on the conditions of the ground. That's the area that we are now moving into. So how is that order going to shape up, and how can we help shape it better? I think these are the questions that the President got exactly right when he developed the national security strategy. He took stock of the world that we are living in today and explained the strategy so that it could help shape a world that's more peaceful and more prosperous. An important part of that strategy for peace and prosperity was to promote a just and sustainable world order. I couldn't agree more on the importance of that international order, nor could I feel more strongly that the emerging international order, the one that will emerge in full as the forces draw down in the Middle East, is largely influenced by a strong American Navy working with global maritime partners. And I know that is blatantly and shamelessly parochial. but I'm told because I'm the CNO I can say things like that. But I'm also going to try to explain to you why. If we use the past as a rudimentary guide, naval power will play a large role in pressuring or influencing international players in the global order and in targeted rapid response. The global orders that preceded 9/11 were in large part maintained not by invasions or large ground forces or by teams ashore, but by units offshore and small units quickly inserted onshore. Looking back, it's clear that we remain the maritime nation that we have been since our founding. That's just a quick look back, but looking forward, we will still need, as I say, our webbed feet. Today, globalization and the global order it thrives on the uninhibited international exchange of resources, goods, and ideas. The international exchange of goods, resources, and ideas happens predominantly at sea. Commercial ships transport the vast majority of goods, tankers transport the majority of resources, and many resources come from the sea itself. And ideas and money crisscross the globe in seconds by virtue of underwater cables that lay on the ocean floors, and in fact, I often say that the internet swims with the fishes. The order and stability of the maritime commons, however, can be disrupted by pirates, by terrorists, by nations staking territorial claims or fighting with their neighbors, or even climate change and natural disasters. What's more is that there's a lot of ocean out there, much more ocean than land, and so there is a lot of area that we must cover, and if you consider the changes in the Arctic, the oceans will only increase in size. But we alone don't need to cover all the world's waterways against the many different threats. There are, after all, global commons that ought to be served by a global response. And this is where partnership fits in, and specifically global maritime partnerships. We in the Navy and the Marines and the Coast Guard embarked on strengthening and expanding those global maritime partnerships long before the National Security Strategy, long before the most recent Quadrennial Defense Review. We documented it in 2007 in the Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power, which is the title of our strategy and which Phil has given you in your packets today. We released it right here in Newport, Rhode Island, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and I, in 2007. And two quick examples of the strength of that partnership. One, which took place here last October when we convened the International Sea Power Symposium again, where 102 countries came together and 92 maritime leaders joined in this room to talk about the opportunities for the future. But even in a more practical sense, it's at play every day in the world, most specifically in the Middle East, where we coordinate a task force, Task Force 151, which is a collaborative counter-piracy effort, and the only place in the world where China, Russia, the United States, Greece, Italy, Japan, the UK, Malaysia, South Korea, Turkey, Australia, and many others are operating every day together in a cooperative effort to curtail the scourge of piracy that exists in the Somali Basin. Beyond strengthening or forming new multilateral partnerships, we in the Navy form a strong bond for our nation's bilateral relationships. My trip to visit my Japanese counterpart is one example, where we work with the Japanese Navy at the high end of warfare in the area of ballistic missile defense and anti-submarine warfare. I've also returned recently from a trip to India, where our ships, our sailors, our aircraft are working cooperatively with our Indian friends, where we continue to increase the level of the exercises that we have with India. And before that, I was in Djibouti, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, where our sailors are training and exercising and assisting our partners and allies. Those are just a few examples of the cooperative partnerships that we enjoy. But suffice it to say that our Navy is on every continent and in every ocean, reassuring, strengthening, developing old partnerships and new and emerging partners in this effort to look to a more cooperative and collaborative global maritime partnership. The way we reassure, strengthen, and develop our friends and allies, which is the currency of our partnership, has stayed relatively stable over time. They're based on personal relationships, they're based on financial and diplomatic support. And I emphasize that they are based on credible military power. And I say credible because if you don't think those other countries around the world are monitoring and tracking and studying what we are doing, I urge you to read many of the academic journals and the white papers that come from countries around the world. They pay attention to what we do, what we say, and how we invest in our Navy and in our military. The credibility of naval forces rests on a capacity to be global and an ability to carry out the 6 core capabilities that we list in our maritime strategy. To be a forward Navy, to be a Navy with that credible power that can be a deterrent force, to be able to control the seas, to be able to project power, to be able to operate in maritime security schemes, and to be able to provide disaster response and humanitarian assistance. And even as the global order changes, as nations and non-state entities change, these fundamentals will not change significantly. The currency of partnership will remain credible military power and commitment. That will not change. But while the currency remains the same, the finances available for that military power at home and around the world are changing. And they're giving rise to new regional centers of power and challenging once established powers. Other panels and some of the experts that will join you in this forum will cover this in detail, but in general, the strength of our nation's defense is predicated on the strength of our nation's economy. And as strategists, we must juxtapose the reality of compressed defense budgets against a growing demand for military and especially naval power around the world. Without diligence, this juxtaposition could easily become a mismatch, where resources are insufficient to meet the expectation of global influence and engagement. In the past, as we entered a downturn in the defense budgets, we could rely on a fleet that had been built in the upturn. We could rely on a resilient industrial base that could weather the lean years. We could even rely on a personnel base that was either large enough to solve any problem through sheer manpower, or a personnel base that could be significantly reduced without a significant effect. But in this downturn, it is different. And this time, it is different for the Navy. This time, it is different because we're the smallest Navy that we have been since 1916. This time, it is different because the fleet shrank in the last period of budget growth. This time, it is different because we have a strategy of engagement, of being out and about, a strategy that requires us to be in more places in the world. This time, it is different because the high-tech threats are proliferating at a faster and faster rate, and they are simply not proliferating among nations, but they're proliferating to non-state actors. This time, it is different because our industrial base, which in the last downturn consisted of 6 major shipbuilding corporations, consists of 2. And this time it is different because for us in the Navy, where we depend upon our nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines, that part of the industrial base at one point involved 8 corporations, and now it is down to 2. This time it is different because we've already reduced our personnel numbers by 16%, and we saw a commensurate rise of cost by 13% when we did that. But I would also tell you, whereas that may all seem negative, this time it is different because we have the best sailors with whom I have ever served in my nearly 40 years in the Navy. This time is very different from those in the past, and that's why I applaud Secretary Gates for laying out some very provocative questions in his speeches that challenge the status quo assumptions. And I think it's time for those provocative questions. It's time for creative thinking and new processes, but more importantly, it's time to act. And we in the Navy have been acting on that. Shortly after becoming the Chief of Naval Operations, I truncated a major shipbuilding program because that ship did not meet the needs of this emerging world order and the capabilities that it was going to provide us. We canceled 2 shipbuilding contracts for littoral combat ships because the prices were outrageous. We've recently made the decision to down select the littoral combat ship to one variant so that we could get a more affordable ship and begin to build those ships in numbers. We've canceled unmanned systems and missile programs that were not delivering on the investments that we made. And we are in the process of reimagining naval power with cyber power and unmanned systems. We've changed our processes to improve the decisions that we make. In the Department of the Navy, we've brought together the Directorates for Intelligence and Command and Control so that we can look at information and cyber in a complete way and make better decisions. We've injected into our decision-making process total ownership costs of manpower and energy, things that will continue to drive our budgets in the future. I'm proud of what the Navy has done, but I really do believe that we must go further. And there are more provocative questions to be asked. We must ask about the potential for procurement squeeze, where growing operations and maintenance costs and an unsustainable rate of increase in personnel costs are going to continue to squeeze us. We must ask if our personnel policies are sufficient. I find it interesting that the personnel policies that we follow, which are based on the laws that the Congress passed, the most recent law that deals with personnel policies was passed in 1986, at a time before we became this very effective joint force that we are today. So how do those laws and policies have to change in the future? And we must ask if our procurement process is adequate for the environment in which we live, where we let a contract on a ship and yet the technology will move rapidly in the 7 to 10 years that it will take to deliver that ship. Those are the types of questions that we have to ask. And most importantly, for you over the next couple of days, we have to ask if we believe that our naval forces today are and will remain sufficient to influence the emerging world order, either through networks, through partnerships, or when needed, for us to act alone. Our Navy is very different than the larger navies of the past. And while our Navy is very different and much smaller, we're also facing a new emerging order that I believe requires more naval power. And I ask everyone here to consider the implication of these changes for our nation and our Navy, to ask those questions, and to have a serious conversation about our strategy for the future. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Yep.
I was interested in the view the Navy has at the moment in light of diminished
I'll repeat the question.
in light of our much reduced military force, the Chinese naval buildup, especially the submarine and intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities, including EMP threat, and in addition to that, talking to General Petraeus the other day, the big concern he and many others have about continuing cyber attacks.
Right. Well, thank you very much. The question was the view that we have with regard to diminishing resources and the Chinese buildup in submarines, ballistic missiles, and also in cyber. You know, I have had the privilege of being able to have some insight into the PLA Navy since about 1993. I've been able to visit their Navy, spend time with their leadership, to include the current chief of the PLA Navy on about 4 occasions in the last couple of years. And I think it's important that we pay attention to those developments and look at that order of battle. But for me, I think it's important that we understand how that Navy is being used and what those changes are, and particularly the operational patterns. And I think that's what we need to look at more clearly, and also to cause the PLA Navy, the PLA, and China to be more open and more transparent and engaging with us, and look at ways that we can move forward in a cooperative way. As I mentioned in one example, we on a daily basis are conducting operations with the PLA Navy, and we've been doing that for about 1.5 years in the Somali Basin. And I think those are some good examples of how we can work together in a very cooperative way. But I do watch the developments in the PLA Navy. I would submit that those developments are even being watched more closely by countries in the region. And our effort will be to engage the PLA Navy, and gain a better understanding of what they're about. Yes, sir, back here.
Thank you for your remarks, Admiral. Just to follow up on that question, I think in late May of this year, there was a presentation by one of the very senior PLA admirals, I think it was Wu, to a delegation of senior American, in Beijing, where he publicly said that everything that was going well between the United States and China was because of Chinese initiatives. Everything that was going poorly was because of American initiatives. And that was, at the time, one of the more threatening comments from their leadership. And it was pooh-bahhed by, I think, our Secretary of Defense. But then the commentators from China have come out since then on several occasions saying that no statement like that gets made without the party's support. So it would seem, at least from that side, that the relationship is not as good as we would have hoped it to have been, and we haven't seen much coming from them on the North Korean incident, or as much on Iran as we had hoped. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you could tie that into your earlier statement and the earlier work that we've done with the Chinese.
Yeah. Well, I think that, as you deal with China, there's always the political level activity that's going on, and the political engagement. But for the Navy and the PLA Navy, I think it's important to note that we are working in a cooperative way in the Middle East. That as the engagements sometimes wax and wane because of events that take place in the world, that we have been able to advance those exercises, that we have developed ways to communicate with their ships while we're at sea. And I would also say that having the opportunity to talk to my counterpart when there is a little bit of a burble in activity that takes place, as took place in their exclusive economic zone a little over a year ago, I believe allows us to continue to gain better understanding, and to and to allow those types of activities to continue to develop over time, and use that as what I call a flywheel as some of the political activity moves up and down. Yes, sir, over here.
Morning, Admiral.
Morning.
I'm pretty loud. If you, I'll try to talk loudly. Microphone nearby. Early on the first day.
There we go.
Okay.
Good technology. Admiral, in a recent issue of Foreign Affairs, Robert Kaplan suggests that the Chinese will indeed have more nuclear submarines within 15 years than we will. I wonder about your comments on those rough expectations. And at the same time, while the Chinese will be expanding their maritime fleet dramatically over this next decade or two, at the same time, up in the Xinjiang westernmost part of their country where the, I have trouble pronouncing it, the Uyghur Turks live, they may have considerable problems to face. And I wonder if you can somehow put those two things in position or something like that.
No, thank you. One, I think that the growth in the PLA Navy's nuclear submarine fleet in 10 or 15 years on the nuclear side, I don't see the numbers generating to exceed ours. As you know, our submarine fleet is all nuclear and extraordinarily capable, particularly with the advent of the new Virginia-class submarine, which has turned out to be an incredible boat for us. But they are building a large submarine fleet, and I've had the opportunity to be aboard one of their newer submarines, and it was a very well-maintained boat with a very professional crew on board. So I think we'll see continued emphasis on the submarine fleet, but the nuclear fleet, subfleet, will rise a little bit slower. I think you point out the issues of China in the West and simply the vastness of the country. There are issues that the leadership in China will have to deal with that are apart from the naval dimension, and so I think it is important that as we look at China, that we look at China in its entirety, that we also look at the relationship that we have with China simply beyond the security sphere, and also take into account the economic aspects. But I kind of look at China as a very large country where governing at times, I'm sure, can be challenging, and look at it in that bigger picture. In the back, yes, sir.
Good morning, Admiral. You touched on things having to do with technology and canceled weapon systems and meeting needs going forward. And with the United States spending about as much in terms of one country as the rest of the world all put together on defense, do you think that in this rapidly evolving technological age and the events in international relations, we have a good dynamic right now of anticipating future needs so that we don't get into eras where we're canceling programs, we're questioning the effectiveness of spending? I think it means bringing together, obviously, people such as yourself and intelligence people and more. Are we getting better or worse, do you think, at the dynamic of anticipating future needs to increase the effectiveness of military spending to keep our country strong, or do we need to do something differently?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's my life in Washington, is trying to look into that very clear crystal ball that's in front of us. And I would say that we do have, and I highlighted that bit of legislation back in 1986, and I really do believe that we as a military have really been able to come together in a joint way and look across the range of capabilities that we have, and to look into that future and see where they need the capabilities. But I would also be reminded of the fact, and I go back in time, that when Secretary McNamara was being asked at his confirmation hearing about the future, never mentioned Vietnam. When then Secretary-designate Cheney, Secretary of Defense-designate Cheney, was being asked at his confirmation hearing, No one asked him about Kuwait and Iraq. And then when Secretary Rumsfeld came around again for his confirmation hearing, I don't think anybody asked him about Afghanistan. And so the challenge that you have is trying to look into that future and see the types of trends that are occurring. And as I look, I also look at the imperative that we have as a nation, which I truly do believe that we are a maritime nation, and that we have global interests. And in order to get to the area where those interests are, we have to cross two great oceans, which generates a force structure that we need to be able to keep that rotation going. The types of ships and airplanes that we have to be able to sustain themselves for long periods of time while they are deployed. And then as we look at where the technology is taking us, I think we look at where the recent developments are, ballistic missiles being one of them, and that is why you're seeing us move more toward a more robust integrated air and missile defense capability. We see that submarines are increasing in numbers and in complexity around the world, and we're making investments to be able to counter that submarine fleet to keep the sea lanes open. And that was really the basis behind the decisions that we made here in the last year. Take this area of information